we have seen that how the male gametophyte of a flower and the female gametophyte develop, and after the development of the male and the female gametophyte, they need to meet or fuse so as to bring about the pollination. So when we talk of pollination or pollination definition, if we say pollination is a process which involves the transfer of the pollen grains, transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. That is what is known as pollination. So it is necessary for the pollen grain and the female gametophyte to fuse together to bring the syngamy. Now pollination depends upon various factors, and these factors may be biotic or abiotic, because when we study about the pollination, we have seen that pollen grains need to meet, it has to reach to stigma. So when it has to reach to the stigma, the pollen grain must be transferred to the stigma, that is the male, and this is the female. So it needs certain media. Now this pollination can be divided into two types. That is, one is the self-pollination and the other is cross-pollination. The cross-pollination is also known as allogamy, or it is also known as xenogamy. All the terms mean the same. The cross-pollination, that is allogamy or xenogamy. Now, what is the major difference between the self-pollination and cross-pollination? In the self-pollination, the pollen grains land onto the stigma of either the same flower or different flower of the same plant. So the plant will be same, but the flower may be same or different. So it is the case of self-pollination, or we call it as autogamy. So autogamy is self-pollination where the two conditions are there, whether the pollen grain will land onto the stigma of the same flower, or it may land onto the stigma of the different plant. So we divide this self-pollination into again two types, autogamy and geitonogamy. So in the case of autogamy and geitonogamy, the major difference is autogamy, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. So it is a perfect case of self-pollination where the pollen grain will be landing onto the stigma of the same flower. But here in this geitonogamy, which is different from autogamy, is the transfer of the pollen grain take place from the anther to the stigma of different flower of same plant. So the plant will be same. The plant, suppose this is the flower, one flower over here and the other flower over here. So the pollen grain from this will land onto the stigma of this flower. Whereas in this case, suppose there are two flowers, the pollen grain over here will move over here in this same flower. So there is a slight difference, and therefore, since the pollen grain in this case, it is in the same flower, it is known as autogamy, and deuterogamy, it is thus a pollen grain from one flower, it goes and meets or lands onto the stigma of the other flower, but same plant. So the plant remains the same. So we can say that genetically, now over here functionally it is cross pollination, because ketogamy is cross pollination, because the pollen grain needs to be transferred from one flower to the other flower, although of the same species, but it is genetically cross pollination. Understand this, genetically it is self pollination, because genetically, the reason being the plant is same, genetically same, and it is cross pollination as the pollen grain needs to be transferred to the other. So functionally it is cross pollination, functionally, and genetically ketogamy is self-pollination. So therefore we are putting it under self-pollination category. So here we have self-pollination divided into two types, whether the movement of the pollen grain is taking place from one flower or it is taking place from one flower to the different flower of the same plant. Now this autogamy has again we have seen certain types in which two types of flowers are seen. So here we have autogamy, which is again having some species show autogamy, but they have depending upon whether the flowers are open or closed, we are putting or dividing autogamy into two types. That is, one is chasmogamous flowers. Now certain species such as oxalis, pansy, they show flowers which have which may be open or which may be closed. So the chasmogamous flowers are those flowers which show autogamy, but these flowers open properly, bringing about the process of self-pollination. The other type is cleistogamous flowers. Now these cleistogamous flowers are actually flowers that never open. That means the flowers, even on reaching maturity, will remain closed, and as a result the pollen grains which are present in that will be fusing with the egg cell over there within the flower itself. So this ensure, because the flower is not opening at all, so what is happening, the complete 100% seed set formation takes place in the cleistogamous flowers, because here the pollen grains are not wasted, but they are directly being utilized for pollination and bringing about the fertilization. So the cleistogamous flowers will always have a complete seed set formation. And when we say seed set formation or seed set formation taking place, seed set means the formation or the fusion of the pollen grains with the egg cells so as to form the seed. So here we have autogamy, self-pollination divided into autogamy and geitonogamy. And autogamy, certain species bring about or they show variation in which there are two kinds of flowers, that is chasmogamous flowers and the cleistogamous flowers. The chasmogamous flowers always remain open, that means they open properly so as to bring about the fusion of the pollen grains with the egg cell, whereas cleistogamous flowers are those flowers which always remain closed even on maturity, and the advantage is they will have complete seed set formation. When we are discussing self-pollination, two things should come to your mind. That self-pollination advantage. When we talk of the advantages, the advantage of self-pollination is the chances of fertilization are more. So therefore, it enables the plant to have a syngamy. The chances or the probability is very high. So it ensures, we are talking of self-pollination, it ensures fertilization. But it has certain disadvantage. If we talk of the disadvantage over here, the major disadvantage of the self-pollination is there is no genetic variability, or the genetic variation is very poor. So the genetic variation is very poor in the case of self-pollination. Now let us talk about the conditions which favor self-pollination or autogamy. The conditions that favor autogamy is that, first thing, the plant should be a bisexual plant, that is having both male and female reproductive organs, so as to facilitate or to bring about the syngamy. That is one condition. The second important condition for self-pollination is that the time of the maturation of the pollen grain and that of the formation of the egg cell, or that is the embryo sac, should be synchronized, so as when the pollen grains land onto the mature stigma, the fertilization can be brought about. And also the position of the stigma and the pollen grain should be so close to each other so as to bring about the pollination effectively. So we find that for self-pollination to happen, the plant should be a bisexual one. Another important thing is the maturity timing, or there should be a complete synchrony between the maturation level of the, or maturation timing of the pollen grain along with that of the egg cell. Also, the position of the male and the female reproductive parts should be very close to each other so as to allow easy transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, can be done very easily. Now let us talk about the cross-pollination. When we talk about cross-pollination, it is a phenomena, or it is a term which we use in which the pollen grains are transferred from the flower, from one flower to the other flower, but different plant. So here, what is happening over here is, this is one flower and this is another plant. So here, the pollen grains should be transferred from one to other. So that there should be a complete transfer of the pollen grain from one plant to the different plant, right? So that is what is known as xenogamy. This is what is known as xenogamy, or we have also called it as allogamy. Now we require certain specific conditions so as to bring about the allogamy or the xenogamy. Now, first condition, which is very, very important for the cross-pollination to take place, that the flowers should be unisexual. That these are the conditions that favor the cross-pollination, or the chances of in other terms we can say that the chances of self-pollination are avoided. So to bring about effectively the cross-pollination and not to have the self-pollination, the flower should be unisexual, that it should be either male or it should be either female. The other important thing is the positioning of the anther, that is the stigma, and the style. That means they should not be very close to each other so that the self-pollination can be avoided. And that term, when we say that we are talking of, is known as heterostyly. Then we have hercogamy. Let me write first, then we'll explain. Okay, that is what is called as dioecious. Then we have it, let's discuss about all these. Unisexual, that we have already told that it is the dioecious condition in which the male and the female are separate. Then we have heterostyly, that is heterostyly is a condition in which the flowers have, they are not very close to each other. That means linium is an example. Linium is an example in which the stigma is at the top and the male is over here. So that the difference is quite a bit, and this ensures that there is no fertilization or self-fertilization. Then it is hercogamy, whereas the male and the female, that is the stigma, has some barrier, some mechanical barrier that does not allow actually the pollen to fuse with it very easily of the same flower. That is what we are talking of. Then dichogamy is the position of the stamen, and that dichogamy in which, the maturation take place at the different time. Occurs at different time. So here the dichogamy in which the maturation is taking place at different times. Now the male sterility, that is pollen grains, do not respond to the stigma of that particular flower, but they will only be responding, or they will germinate later on only after the cross pollination. So there are certain conditions which are necessary for cross pollination to happen, or in other terms we can say that these conditions avoid self pollination and ensures that the flower reproduces only by the cross pollination method. Now then we have this is one classification which talks about this type of pollination, that is self pollination and cross pollination. Now for the cross pollination to happen, there should be certain agents, and these agents depend upon what type of agents, whether living or non-living agents of cross pollination we say. These may be biotic agents or these may be abiotic agents. When we talk of abiotic agents, normally the wind and water are the medium by which the pollen grains of a plant, because here in the case of cross pollination a media is required, agent is required over here. So for the agent to take place, this agents can be wind or water over here, which transfer the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the other flower of the other plant. Then there are certain biotic factors. The biotic factors may be, let's say the bees, that is insects we call it in general, insects. Then it is known as entomophily. Then we have other like bat, that is chiropterophily. Then we have other like snakes we have which act as the agents. The sheep is there, other animals are there. The birds are there. That is known as ornithophilia. So we find there are several agents which are playing role in the transfer of these, that is the pollen grains, from the anther to the stigma of the flower of a different plant in the case of cross pollination. So this pollination process is important in the life of a plant because this only ensures that the fertilization take place and the continuation